Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. The topic of today's episode is mastering 80%. And maybe before listening to this episode, it's probably a good idea to listen to the previous episodes on the idea of 80%, but I'll give a quick recap, and probably most of this episode will still be self-contained. But the 80% idea is an idea I've gotten from Dan Sullivan. I've done it from founder of Strategic Coach, I should say, and I've done 2 episodes on it. And I believe the first one is called something like the virtue of achieving 80% of your potential, which is a somewhat provocative way of putting the idea of 80%, which is that in creating high quality, fast results, it is often a good idea to try to do iterations of something to what you regard as 80% of your potential. So to take a very real example, if I'm working on a book, it might be, working on an outline. I might think, okay, I'm going to get an outline that's at the level of, 80%. And then I can decide, okay, I'm going to write from that, or I'm going to even work on another iteration of the outline. Actually, outlining is just forget outline. I'll talk more about that a little later. But if you just think about, drafting something, whatever your process for outlining or not, the idea is that the goal is, so this is how to think of it. The goal is I want a first draft that's kind of 80% of what I think I can do. And the value of that is it uses a significant amount of one's ability and deploys a lot of one's judgment, but it creates something concrete and real that one learns a lot from creating. So if I'm just creating, let's not even say a book, but like a 1,000-word article on something, if I plan it, make a quick plan and then execute and then write it, my knowledge of how to write a good article about that is going to be dramatically larger after I've written it, after I've written that 80% version versus before. And then the idea is once I've written it, then if I want to improve it, then I can revise it myself. And then I can say, okay, let's just revise this to 80% of my potential. And I'll be able to do that quickly. Or I can bring in some specialist and tell them, hey, look at this to 80% of your potential. And you can iterate as many times as you want. So there's no limit on quality, but it's much, much faster than saying I need to do this version, this iteration to 100% of my potential, because that ends up being very paralyzing. It's a form of perfectionism, and it leads to a lot of procrastination. And there's this illusion that, well, if I just plan it perfectly, then it will be perfect. And then there's this idea, well, there's not really a perfect version. You can get a better and better version, but the way to do that is to engage with it. So today's episode is about what I've learned executing this idea, but it's what I've learned executing this idea after a long period of not executing this idea. So it's actually, I've needed to learn how to do 80% at a much higher level because I had a project where I didn't do the 80% approach nearly enough at the outset. And so I'll just give you a little bit of background. I was talking to a good friend of mine named Keith Schacht. He's the founder of a company called mystery.org, which you can check out. I might have mentioned it on the show before, but he and I talk a lot about strategy and, in our different, mostly business endeavors and different kinds of projects. And when I shared with him the idea of 80%, which is very much how he normally functions, he's very good at iterating on things. He said to me, this was, 6 months ago or so, he said to me, okay, how do you apply that to the book you're working on? Like, what would it mean to do 80% on the book? And this is the new version of the moral case for fossil fuels. And my response, and this is a dangerous kind of response to ever have, which is, well, I think this book is kind of an exception to that because I really, I have the time. I have the time with this book to really make it everything I want it to be. And so I'm just going to keep working on the outline, and I got to really get the outline perfect and just get a full integrated understanding of everything, and then I'll execute on it. And it turned out this is, for reasons I mentioned on the last episode before this, it turns out that does not work very well for me and probably for anyone. And there are details of this, but it has to do with the nature, I think, of outlining and writing. And at least for me, having a super, super detailed outline where every detail is like where almost every little logical relationship is worked out before doing any writing or rewriting, it's just not something that I can do very well. And so what happened is, working on the outline too much, I would end up just changing it over and over and over, and I couldn't get 100% satisfied with it. And then it served as a form of, there's this perfectionism with the outline, and then it served as procrastination. And it really delayed my progress revising the book. I learned a lot while working on it. I was working very hard, but I just wasn't working in this iterative way. I was really trying to do one iteration to 100% of my potential, and it had all the problems I've talked about in the different 80% episodes. So let's fast forward. In the last 2 months, I really realized, okay, I'm going to do this 80% thing with my book. And it's just been, and I have a deadline near the end of this year. And so that was a good forcing function. It really just made me get down to business. And it's just been amazing how much I've learned by doing an iterative approach, where instead of saying, okay, I'm going to do one perfect draft of it, the goal is and this is an idea I got from Keith, have it be, you're going to do maybe 4 different drafts of it. So when you're passing through it, it doesn't have to be, well, this draft is perfect, but this draft has to be a significant improvement. And then every time you go through it, then you're going to learn a lot about the thing as a whole. And that's really turned out to be totally the case, that taking an iterative approach is just making me learn so much about the book and how to improve it. But why I think this will be helpful, though, is because I'm doing this so late in the game, and I have a lot of other stuff going on, I've really needed to get good at this 80%. And it's really, and some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is related to 80% specifically, but all of it is just related to increasing productivity. And I feel like it's a weird thing, because it's a situation where I'm not thrilled. I put myself in the situation of having a book deadline, but then a whole bunch of other stuff, such as I had a debate recently, which fortunately went really well. You can check it out at fossilfueldebate.com. But the debate is a lot of preparation. It had a lot of talks. And then I have a whole bunch of different kinds of projects. As I really, really overbooked myself, particularly for this part of the year. And I've really been working more than I like to work. I've talked about on previous episodes how I think it's good to have an idea that you want to have a relaxed state of productivity, where there are periods where I can be really productive, but I'm not fundamentally tense about it. And then there are lots of periods of different kinds of recreation and rejuvenation. And lately, I've been working more like the CEO of a new startup that's running out of money. Not that I'm running out of money, but just I have all of these deadlines. But so I don't advocate working as hard as I've been working at all, and I do not want to do it after this year very often. I don't want to set myself up that way. But nevertheless, I have learned a lot from it's not just working this hard, but it's having to work really hard and then to figure out real ways to become even more efficient with my work. So I thought that just as I've gotten some benefits from this situation of needing to really take productivity to the next level, I thought that I would share some of the ideas and practices that I've either gotten or that I've improved during this period of very intense productivity. And I should say one thing about how I view periods of what we can call overwork, or where it's just pushing myself and it's just so much will involved, or at least pushing through fatigue sometimes. Although I still don't do much. I still really try to avoid fatigue. So I meditate and take naps and whatnot. I really try not, and as much as possible, try to sleep. Sometimes it's difficult to sleep if I've got any kind of tension around a deadline. But in general, I'm not a big fan of compromising any kind of rest or rejuvenation. But still, there's just this thing of the day just being stacked. Every hour is something, and a lot has to be done in that hour. My philosophy on this is this is not a way one wants to live all the time. And I think some people do live that way, and I think that's unfortunate, and it often goes along with a lot of other problems. But I do think it's a good thing that if you have goals and you have specific commitments that are real commitments, it's a good quality to be able to work, in a sense, too hard when necessary. So there are these times when I'm working too hard, but I'm proud that I'm willing to work, quote unquote, too hard when I really need to. But then I don't, I'm proud of myself for being willing to do it when it's necessary, but I'm not proud of making it necessary. So then I think strategically, okay, how can I set things up so such that it can be in a more, everything can be at a more relaxed pace in the future? Because as I discussed on, I forget which episode, but on standards, I think it was about calibrating standards of success. If you just have the idea that you just want to be as productive as possible and that's everything, that's just this infinite obligation that can be miserable, versus viewing productivity as a crucial part of flourishing that can be really beneficial. Okay, so let's just get into some of these specific things that I've learned, and I'll just go through them pretty quickly. So one is that, and this is pretty much contained in what I've said before, but this is a different angle, is constraints breed creativity. So in working on the book, I've had days where I have to iterate through to make it on the pace that I've set myself. I need to edit one chapter a day. And I have certain standard for what it means to edit the chapter. And one of the things is that I have to have what I call a reverse outline, what other people sometimes call a reverse outline, on a certain level of detail for the chapter. So before I consider the chapter edited, I have to have a reverse outline that's at a certain level of detail where that outline explicitly explains the logical structure of the edited product that I have. So sometimes, let's say there's a section of the book and I don't, for any given subhead of the book, if you know the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, but even if you don't, you can say like there's a sub chapter each chapter, and that might be between 1,000 and 2,000 words. And then each of those, I only want to have, let's say, 5 to 8 points. If there are 16 points in a sub chapter, something is off, and all the points have to logically interrelate. So for me, that's a constraint, is that the points have to logically interrelate, and that has to be explicit. So that's part of my standard. And then part of it is the thing has to read coherently. It can't just be, nonsense. And so that's a constraint. But then the constraint is you have to do this in the day. And it's usually in about a 5-hour chunks, about 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. is really when I get to work. And what I found is that those are hard constraints to have, certainly with some of the material. And what I found, though, is it's amazing when I have those constraints, how much creativity comes up. This past week alone, on several days, I've figured out pretty dramatic things about how to improve the logic of my argument in different chapters that if I hadn't had these constraints, I think would have taken me a lot longer, because I would have maybe focused on, I really want to work on this paragraph or this formulation. But if I had it as, well, no, the whole outline has to be coherent and explicit. And then there were certain parts where clearly in the previous version of the book, there were way too many points here and the ordering was wrong, and I'd really have to figure that out. And it was just very dramatic how much I figured out because of these very specific constraints. And this connects to the discussion of flow that I've had in some previous weeks. Those kinds of constraints can be part of having a very clear goal. But a wrinkle on the constraint. So I've found that these specific constraints and deadlines as part of the constraint are great, but and this is a point I got from my friend Keith Schacht also, he said, it's much better if in general the constraints are low stakes or the deadlines are low stakes. So as in, you don't feel like, the world is going to end if I don't do this. But there's an art of saying, I have a strong commitment, but the strong commitment is I really want to do this. It's not that I feel like my life is going to be over if I don't do this. Because if I feel like my life is going to be over and then I don't do this, if I don't do this, then it can lead to performance, but it also can lead to a lot of misery. And you can think about maybe in a game, if you're just playing a game and you think, wouldn't it be fun to see if I can make 10 shots in a minute in basketball or something, if I'm just on my own, and I'm not a particularly good shooter. Now that can be fun and really try to do it, but otherwise it's not going to work at all. But not feel like, oh, if I don't do it, it's going to be a negative. So to use an Ayn Rand term, there's an element of motivation by love versus motivation by fear, and I've noticed that to the extent that things are not enjoyable, sometimes it's often because the goal is viewed as too high stakes. And that's why it's a good idea to, with a longer term project, have goals of earlier iterations where one doesn't feel like, oh, I really have to finish it by this date. And then there's a lot of pressure. And so I'm somewhat in that situation of having it be more high stakes than I would like in terms of any given day's performance. But I think I can separate out, okay, the constraints are good, but the high stakes is something that I want to avoid, at least for the particular day-to-day constraints that I'm setting myself. Another idea, and I mentioned this, I believe, last week, but I'll just say it again because I think it's valuable, is an idea I got from Neil Gaiman on the Tim Ferriss, who is a guest. He's a writer who's a guest on the Tim Ferriss show, or Tim Ferriss podcast, whatever it's called. And he talks about, my recollection of this is the idea that when you're working, give yourself the freedom to do nothing, but you can either do nothing or you can do work. So the idea is, and I don't have to work when it's my writing time. I can do nothing, but that's all I can do. I can either do work or do nothing. And so it's liberating to have that feeling of, okay, I don't have, if my mind doesn't want to do this second, I don't have to do it. I can just rest, but I can't do anything else. And so for me, I'll allow myself to meditate or even do what I call a Seinfeld nap, which is, you'll have to listen to another episode to get that, but something where there's no real diversion for me. It might just be resting. I found that incredibly valuable. Another idea is what I'll call feeling the future, which is when I'm working and when I encounter any kind of resistance, really try to viscerally feel what the future me will feel like depending on what I do. So if I had this experience on Monday where I was doing arguably the most difficult chapter of the book, or editing. It required the most difficult edits, and I had a lot of trouble in the morning on it. And toward the end of the morning, I just started to crack what was going on in the chapter. And then I had literally 7 hours of activities after that. I had a bunch of meetings and a couple of different presentations, including a speech to students, and then like a challenging Q&A afterward, and then a dinner afterward, and then going back to my hotel. And so I had 7 hours, but I was so clear in my mind how good my future self would feel if I finished this chapter that day, and how I would not feel good if I didn't, that I was able to just get it together and spend probably about 2.5 hours just what they say, what they call crushing it at the end of the day. And it was just so satisfying to do. But I was really able to feel that future satisfaction earlier in the day versus the focus being on present fatigue or present difficulties. So I found that to be quite a valuable skill. Another idea is, and I'm not saying any of these are revolutionary, I've just found them to be particularly useful in I found myself getting better at them, is what we can call the idea of the 10-minute try. And I was reminded of this idea and had it reinforced recently when I was listening to Jerry Seinfeld, one of my productive heroes, and he was on, I think, the Tom Papa show, or I think it's called What a Joke. It's this Netflix-based podcast, but it's not actually on Netflix. It's by Netflix. Anyway, he was talking about writing and how many comedians don't like to write, and how they like to just work stuff on the stage. And Seinfeld was talking about, it's hard writing, or maybe Tom Papa was saying it's hard writing, or his co-star, I think her name is Fortune something, his co-host, it's hard writing. And Seinfeld said, but it's hard for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then it's pretty easy and fun. And that just reminded me of how many things in life can be hard, or at least there's resistance for 10 minutes, and then after 10 minutes, you just don't want to leave them. And so that's just a good reminder that, okay, with everything, I'm not going to even think about whether I want to do it. If it's on the schedule, I'm just going to I'll just say, okay, you just do it for 10 minutes and then see how you feel. And it's just amazing how after that 10 minutes, I'm totally into it. But if I can spend a lot of time before that 10 minutes doing just thinking about, oh, can I really do this? Am I going to really have the energy? And part of this idea of the 10-minute try is you really have no idea how you're going to feel in 10 minutes with something, because partially you don't really know how much you have in you. And then also you don't know what the task is going to be like. The task will often seem much more difficult outside the task than within the task. I mean, it seems crazy if I just think in a certain moment, I think, how am I going to write couple thousand words today? That seems really hard. How am I going to go give a speech on stage? I don't feel like I can do that at this moment. But then once the conditions are in place, yeah, you can often do those things. But often there's an issue of, well, you have to take the first step. So you have to take that first 10 minutes. Couple more ideas. This is one I got from a guy named Brian Koppelman, who's the creator of Billions. And this might be the best productivity idea I have had or gotten in the last 6 months, maybe since 80%. And it's not his idea, but he referred me to it. It's an exercise called Morning Pages by a woman named, I believe, Julia Cameron, a writing teacher. And I don't think I've talked about this on a previous episode because I don't even know if I was doing it 2 weeks ago, but it's one of these things that's really, particularly for me, and my own disposition and tendencies, it's just amazing. And the idea of morning pages is it's particularly designed for artists in the broad sense, including writers and often people who have resistance for things, which I don't have too much of, but I still find this useful. The idea is you just get up, first thing in the morning when you get up, you just write 3 pages by hand. I do it on an iPad with lined iPad paper, but you just write 3 pages by hand of whatever is on your mind. And there's no restrictions beyond that. It's just you get up. The constraint is you get up and you write 3 pages, whatever you want. And I've found this, I would do things like this. I'd sometimes take a walk and talk into my recorder and get it transcribed. But there's something about writing it out longhand where what I find is that basically every morning there's certain stuff that's on my mind that I need to process a little bit before I'm exactly ready to write. And then there's also thinking about what I'm going to write today, because for me in the morning it's usually writing, almost always writing that I'm going to do, and just thinking about that and raise it. I'll just end up raising the things that are on my mind, and I've just found it creates this incredible momentum into the actual writing of the day, because I just end up thinking through the things that are blocking me or that I'm afraid of or that I don't want to forget for later. And for me in particular, I was finding it hard to sleep, particularly in the last iteration of my book. I had set myself a really intense deadline, and I had actually made an agreement with a friend to pay him a whole bunch of money if I didn't meet it. So it was a pretty intense deadline, maybe too intense. But I was waking up at 3 a.m. and thinking about things, and I have ideas like, what do I put here? And I wouldn't know what to do. Like, hey, should I just listen to episodes of Seinfeld and try to get to sleep, or should I do my writing? But then and then with this morning pages, it just worked like a charm, because it would just be 3 a.m. and I would do the morning pages, or at least part of it. And then I would end up resolving what was ever bothering me and also starting to make progress for the day. And then I'd usually go back to sleep, and then I could get up at 6 or 7 and start writing. So you can look it up, but it's really, there's something about it where it really, at least for me, captures, and it really, I should say, fulfills what my own morning creative needs are. So that's something I might not have tried implementing immediately had I not really been in the mode of needing to juice up my productivity. But I think that's something I will be doing for a long time. And the testimonials of people using this are just crazy in terms of how many people credit their success with doing this every morning, and people who just had huge difficulty writing anything and how much it helped them. Okay, a couple more things. There is, so one other idea, I thought I had 2, but I can only see one in my notes, which is, oh no, there are 2 more I see. So One is an idea, and this is not an exact quote, but I got it from Dan Sullivan. It's the idea that if you have a problem that money can solve, then you don't have a problem. So if you have a problem that money can solve, then you don't have a problem. And this is just something where they, particularly when people start making any kind of money, they don't realize how many things you can improve in life with money. It's usually, well, I can buy this car or something, or I can buy a nicer house, but you can buy time. That's the real thing you can buy with money, including things that free up time. And I won't go into the details of mine, but there was something I needed in my home, basically. I needed a soundproof environment in my home. Sometimes for me, because I have a home office, but it's not fully insulated from the rest of the house, and I have a dog and a girlfriend, and there's stuff and an assistant, and there's all kinds of stuff going on in the house. And so I got myself a soundproof room to work in, and that buys me time. And it also, and this is not at all cruel, but sometimes my dog's crate needs to go in the room, because we're training him to be in his crate, and sometimes he'll bark a lot. And I hope I don't get a lot of hate mail about this, because it's a very nice thing and it's all air conditioned and everything, but it essentially allows him to be in his crate, and if he's barking, and we're working on that, but it doesn't upset the neighbors, whereas before it's upsetting the neighbors. And so it just created this situation where every time he started barking, it would just be a mortgage on my time. And so we created an environment where, no, he can bark and we can resolve those issues over a longer period of time. So it's just, wow, paying for this soundproof room, that's bought me so much time and peace of mind. And then one final idea is that perfectionism is the enemy of iteration. I've really noticed lately how much, so perfectionism, particularly per iteration, the idea that any given iteration has to be perfect. I was noticing this when preparing for a debate, just thinking, yeah, I have to do the perfect intro. And it's just so paralyzing, and it leads to so much procrastination. And thinking with my book, yeah, I've got to have an outline for the perfect draft. So it'll just be basically perfect the first time I write it, or the first editing pass I do. And then that leads to so much procrastination. And the real thing is, if you want it to be really, really good, that's great. That just means more iterations. So that's the perspective I have now. It's not that I have a lower idea of quality, but that I don't have this perfectionism per iteration. I can just have a high standard or a high aspiration. And as I go on, I can decide, yeah, I want to do one more iteration. I want to do one more iteration, but not have this perfectionism on any given iteration. So those are some ideas and tactics that I've found very useful in this sort of forced state of 80% mastery. I'm glad that in a period of some difficulty, I've figured these out for myself. I hope that they are useful to you. And if you have any other ideas along these lines, I would love to hear them. So if you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com. No response promised, but I do read what you send. Also, if you want to join the discussion at facebook.com/humanflourishingproject, feel free to do so. And then if you want bi-weekly updates or whenever the new shows come out, usually once every 2 weeks, go to humanflourishingproject.com. Okay, that is it for this week. I will talk to everyone in a couple weeks. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.